The leaving is not the hardest part. Most people think it is. They imagine the moment of departure, the door closing, the silence after, the first night alone, as the peak of the crisis. And it is a crisis, but it is not the peak. Because the empath who leaves a narcissist does not simply leave a person. They leave a psychic system, an architecture of mirroring and distortion that has been rewriting their interior for months, sometimes years, sometimes so long that they cannot remember who they were before it began. Carl Jung identified something he called the complex, a cluster of emotionally charged associations that operates autonomously within the psyche, often without the individual's awareness, directing behavior and perception from beneath the surface of conscious thought. When the empath enters a relationship with someone whose narcissistic wounding runs deep, what forms between them is not simply a bond. It is a shared complex, a psychic structure that becomes a third entity, neither fully one person nor the other, that governs the relational field with a logic of its own. Leaving that person is not the same as leaving the complex. The complex travels with you. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul." That sentence will mean something specific to you if you have left, or are trying to leave, a relationship that consumed you at a depth that no one outside it can fully understand. Because the leaving, when it finally comes, forces exactly the confrontation Jung describes. Not with the other person, with your own soul. With the parts of yourself that were activated, distorted, suppressed, and exploited during the time you spent inside the relational field, and that do not simply snap back to their original position when the relationship ends. What happens when an empath leaves a narcissist is not what you expect. It is not relief followed by healing. It is a four-stage psychological process: a descent, a confrontation, a death, and a rebirth, that closely mirrors what Jung described as the individuation journey itself. In the next 25 minutes, we move through those four stages with the precision of Jungian depth psychology. Not to advise, not to motivate, but to map the territory so that if you are in it, you recognize where you are, and know that the confusion is not a sign of failure, it is a sign of transformation already underway. Now let's go into the aftermath, the real one, the one no one prepares you for. You left, or they discarded you and the leaving was not yours to choose. Either way, the physical separation has occurred. And here is what no one adequately warned you about. The separation does not feel like freedom. It feels like amputation. Not because you miss the person, not exactly. What you miss, what your nervous system screams for in the first days and weeks and sometimes months, is something more precise and more disturbing. You miss the field. The psychic architecture of the relationship, which for all its cruelty, provided something your psyche had become dependent on, a structure of meaning. A way of organizing your day, your attention, your emotional energy, your entire identity around a single focal point. You were the one who understood, the one who stayed, the one who saw behind the mask, the one who believed, with genuine depth and genuine intelligence, that your love could reach the unreachable. And now that focal point is gone, and the structure collapses. And what is revealed underneath is not the person you were before the relationship. It is a void. Jung's psychology offers an explanation for this that goes deeper than attachment theory, deeper than trauma bonding, deeper than the neurochemical explanations, though all of those are valid and real. What Jung identified was the concept of projective identification, the unconscious process by which one person places their own disowned psychological material into another person and then relates to the other person as if they are that material. In the empath-narcissist dynamic, this process runs in both directions simultaneously, creating an extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily destructive psychological circuit. The narcissist projects their disowned vulnerability onto the empath, the tenderness they cannot own, the neediness they despise in themselves, the deep well of unacknowledged feeling that was rejected early in their own psychological development. All of this gets deposited into the empath, who receives it willingly because receiving is their gift, because feeling is their medium, because the narcissist's vulnerability, when it briefly surfaces, is the most genuine thing the empath has ever touched in them. Simultaneously, the empath projects their disowned power onto the narcissist. the forcefulness they have never claimed, the decisiveness they struggle with, the capacity to take up space without apology. Qualities that the empath shadowed long ago, often in childhood, are seen in the narcissist and interpreted as strength, confidence, charisma. The empath is drawn to what they cannot own in themselves. The narcissist is drawn to what they cannot feel in themselves. The circuit is complete. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." When the relationship ends, the projections do not automatically retract. This is the structural reason the bond persists. The empath is still carrying the narcissist's projected vulnerability. It has become fused with their own emotional reality, indistinguishable from their native feelings. And the power they projected onto the narcissist? It is still out there, in the image of the person they left, which is why the narcissist can continue to loom so large in the empath's interior long after physical contact has ended. The phantom bond is not weakness, it is not nostalgia, it is not evidence that you still love the person who hurt you. It is the persistence of a psychic circuit that has not yet been dismantled, because the material that created it has not yet been reclaimed by its original owners. The philosophical dimension here is significant. The empath's recovery from a narcissistic relationship is not primarily about processing what was done to them. It is about reclaiming what was taken from them, the projected power they gave away, and returning what was left in them, the projected vulnerability that was never theirs to hold. This is shadow work in its most direct, most practical, most urgently necessary form. The bond you feel is not love still living. It is a projection still unclaimed. Something happens to the empath's sense of self inside a narcissistic relationship that is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. It is not merely that the narcissist criticizes or diminishes the empath, though they often do. It is something more architecturally damaging. The narcissist, over time, becomes the empath's primary mirror, the source through which the empath interprets their own worth, their own reality, their own perception. This does not happen because the empath is weak. It happens because of a specific psychological vulnerability that the empath carries, one that was present long before the narcissist arrived. The empath's self-structure is, by nature, porous. It is built for reception, for attunement, for calibration to the emotional frequencies of others. This porosity, which in healthy relationships allows for deep connection and mutual understanding, becomes, in the presence of a narcissist, the mechanism of the empath's psychological colonization. The narcissist does not merely influence the empath, they gradually replace the empath's internal reference system with themselves. Jung described a phenomenon he called inflation and deflation of the ego, the process by which an individual's sense of self can be artificially expanded or contracted through identification with an archetype or a complex. In the narcissistic relational system, the empath undergoes systematic deflation, not always through overt cruelty, often through the far more insidious mechanism of intermittent validation, the unpredictable oscillation between being made to feel utterly central and being made to feel completely invisible. This oscillation creates a condition in which the empath's self-esteem becomes externally calibrated. When the narcissist reflects them warmly, they exist. When the narcissist withdraws that reflection, they don't. The internal barometer of self-worth, which should be connected to the individual's own values, experiences, and accumulated self-knowledge, becomes disconnected and rerouted through the narcissist's approval. When the relationship ends, this mirror shatters, and the empath is left not merely heartbroken, but identityless. Not in the dramatic, cinematic sense of amnesia, in the more common and more devastating sense of not knowing what they like, what they want, what they feel about themselves absent the narcissist's reflection, the preferences that were subtly overwritten, the boundaries that were slowly eroded, the perceptions that were systematically questioned until the empath stopped trusting their own interior as a reliable source of information. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The identity collapse that follows leaving a narcissist is the unconscious becoming conscious, painfully, disoriently, all at once. Every compromise that was made without awareness, every self-abandonment that was performed under the guise of love, every boundary that was surrendered so gradually that its absence wasn't noticed, All of it surfaces simultaneously in the void left by the departed mirror. This is the most terrifying phase, and it is also, paradoxically, the most fertile. Because the identity that collapsed was not, in Jungian terms, the self. It was a complex bound persona, a version of the self that had been constructed in response to the narcissist's needs, organized around the narcissist's approval, and maintained at the cost of the empath's own psychological integrity. What collapsed was the prison. What remains, beneath the rubble, is the material from which a genuine self can finally be built. But that building doesn't happen automatically. It requires the empath to sit in the ruins without immediately constructing a new relationship, a new identity, a new mirror. To endure the discomfort of not knowing who they are, and to discover that this not knowing, when tolerated rather than fled from, is not emptiness. It is possibility. The mirror that broke was never showing you. It was showing what someone else needed you to be. This is the section that many empaths will resist. I ask that you stay, because there is a version of the empath-narcissist story that locates all the pathology in the narcissist. The narcissist was the abuser, the empath was the victim. And in the immediate, practical, ethical sense, this is often true. The narcissist's behavior, the manipulation, the gaslighting, the exploitation of the empath's emotional generosity is genuinely harmful and genuinely their responsibility. But Jungian psychology asks a harder question. Not to blame the empath, not to minimize the narcissist's actions, but to honor the empath's own psychological depth by taking seriously the question, what in my own unconscious drew me into this, kept me there, and made it feel like love? This is the shadow reckoning, and it is indispensable. Jung's concept of the shadow, when applied to the empath who chose a narcissist, reveals several layers that popular psychology tends to skip. The first layer is the shadow projection we discussed earlier. The empath projects their own disowned power onto the narcissist, experiencing the narcissist's dominance as the forcefulness they secretly wish they could express. The second layer goes deeper. The empath's shadow often contains a need to be needed that, when examined honestly, is not purely altruistic. It is also a mechanism of control. When you are the irreplaceable emotional anchor, the only one who truly understands, the steady presence in the other person's chaos, you are also, in a sense, indispensable. And indispensability provides a form of safety that the empath, who may never have felt securely attached without proving their worth, desperately requires. The narcissist exploits this need because they sense it with the precision of someone whose survival has always depended on reading others. They don't simply take from the empath. They give the empath the one thing the empath's shadow hungers for, the feeling of being essential, irreplaceable, the center of someone's universe, even if that universe is unstable and cruel. The third layer is perhaps the most uncomfortable. In the empath's shadow, alongside the disowned power and the hidden need for indispensability, there often lives a capacity for boundary violation that mirrors the narcissist's own. Not in the same direction, the narcissist violates outward, the empath violates inward. But the violation is structurally similar. The empath who stays in a relationship that systematically harms them is violating their own boundaries with the same consistency that the narcissist is violating them from outside. They are both, in different ways, participating in the destruction of the empath's integrity. Jung wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." This is the hardest work. And it is the work that the leaving ultimately demands. Because if the empath leaves the narcissist without examining their own shadow, without understanding the unconscious needs, the projected power, the capacity for self-violation that made the dynamic possible, they will, with mathematical psychological precision, recreate the pattern. Not with the same person, with a different person who activates the same complex. The faces change, the architecture remains. The shadow reckoning is not self-blame, it is self-knowledge, the kind that prevents recurrence by illuminating the internal structure that made the external destruction possible. It is the most radically loving thing the empath can do for themselves. To say, not as accusation but as honest inquiry, what in me said yes to this? What in me stayed? What in me found this familiar, and why? The answers to those questions are not comfortable. They lead backward, usually to childhood, to the original relational template in which love required self-sacrifice, in which safety required usefulness, in which belonging required the abandonment of personal boundaries. The narcissist did not create these patterns. They found them, they exploited them. And the empath, by examining them with the honest depth that Jungian psychology demands, can finally dismantle them. The narcissist showed you your wound. The healing is yours to do. Something is happening that you cannot see yet. In the months, sometimes years, following the end of a narcissistic relationship, the empath undergoes a transformation that is invisible from the outside and almost unrecognizable from the inside. It doesn't feel like healing. It feels like disorientation, like walking through a familiar room in the dark after the furniture has been rearranged. Everything you reach for is not where it was. The emotional responses you relied on no longer work the way they did. The self-concept you operated from has been shattered, and the new one hasn't finished forming. This is not dysfunction. In Jungian terms, this is the nigredo, the blackening, the first and most disorienting phase of the alchemical process that Jung adopted as a psychological metaphor for transformation. The nigredo is the phase of decomposition, of dissolution, of everything you thought you were falling apart, so that what you actually are can begin to assemble from the genuine material rather than from the projected, complex-bound, narcissist-organized version. And within the nigredo, if the empath can tolerate it without fleeing into a new relationship, a new obsession, a new external focus, something extraordinary begins to occur. The power that was projected onto the narcissist begins to return. Not all at once, in fragments, in moments of unexpected assertiveness that surprise the empath because they don't recognize the voice as their own. In sudden clarity about a situation that would previously have been obscured by self-doubt. In the quiet, almost bewildering experience of doing something not because it serves someone else, but because they want to. The narcissist's vulnerability that was carried by the empath also begins to discharge. The ambient sadness lifts, not immediately, but gradually, as the empath's psychic system begins to sort what is native from what was deposited, the emotional load lightens. Not because the empath is feeling less, they are still an empath, they will always feel deeply, but because the feelings returning are theirs, calibrated to their own life, their own losses, their own present circumstances, not the displaced, unmetabolized emotional material of someone who never learned to carry their own. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The rebirth is painful. That is its authentication. If it were easy, it would be a performance, another persona constructed to cover the wound. The genuine article hurts. It involves the discovery that certain things you loved about yourself were actually adaptations to the narcissist's requirements. That certain things you despised about yourself were actually healthy impulses that the relational system needed you to suppress. That the person emerging from the rubble is not the person you expected, and is, in many ways, a stranger." Jung called this the confrontation with the self, the encounter with the totality of who you actually are, beneath every mask, every adaptation, every complex that shaped your behavior without your knowledge. The self, in Jungian terms, is not the idealized version of who you could be. It is the complete version, including the darkness, the power, the anger, the capacity for assertion, the hunger for genuine rather than performative connection. Everything the narcissistic relationship suppressed. Everything the empath's own shadow concealed. This confrontation cannot be rushed. It has its own timing. The empath who allows it to unfold, who sits in the nigredo without reaching for the nearest available light source, discovers something that no amount of external validation could have provided. They are not, and never were, the diminished person the narcissist's mirror reflected. They are someone far more complex, far more capable, far more internally resourced than they ever had the chance to discover inside the claustrophobic psychic architecture of the narcissistic relationship. What grows in the space the narcissist used to occupy is not happiness, not initially. What grows is interiority. The reclaimed inner landscape that was colonized by the relationship gradually fills with the empath's own material, their own desires, their own creative impulses, their own standards for how they will allow themselves to be treated, based not on the narcissist's intermittent approval, but on their own, hard-won, absolutely non-negotiable sense of their own worth. That sense of worth is different from the one that existed before the relationship. It is not the naive, unboundaried openness that the empath entered the relationship with. It is tempered, tested, informed by experience. It knows what it will not tolerate, because it has lived inside what happens when tolerance has no floor. What the narcissist took from you was never yours to keep. What grows back is yours forever. There is a version of you that you have not yet met, not the person you were before the relationship. That person, however loved, however missed, was carrying the very vulnerabilities that made the narcissistic dynamic possible. The nostalgia for who you were before is understandable, but it is not the destination. The destination is someone who has never existed until now. Someone forged in the particular fire of having been seen through the wrong mirror and surviving the destruction of everything that mirror reflected. Someone whose boundaries are not theoretical, but experiential, built from the wreckage of what happened when there were none. Someone whose capacity for love has not been diminished by the abuse, but refined by it, stripped of the compulsive, boundaryless, self-abandoning quality that made it exploitable, and replaced with something rarer, the ability to love from wholeness rather than from need. Jung understood that the most meaningful transformations in human life are not the ones that go smoothly. They are the ones that require the ego to die, the old, adapted, complex-bound version of the self to dissolve, so that something truer and more durable can take its place. The empath who has survived a narcissistic relationship and done the shadow work, the boundary reclamation, the slow and painful rediscovery of their own interior, that person has undergone an involuntary initiation into what Jung called individuation. Not the version of individuation that happens in a comfortable chair with a thoughtful analyst, the version that happens in the field, under fire, through loss. And what emerges is not damage, it is depth. The depth that comes from having been to the bottom and discovering that the bottom was not the end. That beneath the collapse, beneath the identity dissolution, beneath the shadow reckoning and the phantom bond, and the terrible clarifying months of not knowing who you are, beneath all of that, there was a self. Real, intact, waiting. That self is not fragile. That self was the one thing the narcissist, for all their skill at distortion and destruction, could never actually reach. If this touched something real in you, the kind of recognition that doesn't need explanation, subscribe. Not for advice, for the company of people who have been in the same fire and are doing the same work. You are not alone in this, and what you are becoming through this is not what anyone would have chosen. But it may be the most genuinely alive version of yourself that has ever existed.